Well, greetings, friends, and welcome back to our video podcast with the Reverend Steve Autrey, my good friend and cohort. I'm Paul Thompson from Huntersville United Methodist Church, and we're so glad that you'll give us these few minutes this morning. We have, I think, what's going to be some interesting discussion for you going on today, and as we make this case, as we've tried to make it throughout the season of Advent, that Jesus just didn't parachute into the world out of context, but there is a whole history, a whole biblical history that we have to try to understand in order to understand the fullness of the context of Jesus coming into the world.
Right.
So
we're getting very close to Christmas, getting into this
closer
last days of Advent, and you can tell that Paul and I have no idea what season it is. we think
I'm wearing Halloween, and
I don't know
what you wear.
Whatever I usually wear, one of the 5 shirts I actually wear. So, but we are trying to focus on the fact that we're getting to that point in time where we celebrate the birth of Christ. And in order to do that, so many times we see that manger scene. It's on Christmas cards, it's in our churches, it's in our homes, and we don't really stop to think about what brought that back. And I know we've been talking about, this was part of God's plan for all time, right? For Jesus to come into the world, for God to physically be present in the world with us. But it helps to understand what led to that moment from a historical point of view. And the people of Israel had a long history. And what's interesting to me is that for a nation and a people who have so much influenced the course of world history, they never were very powerful.
It's fascinating to me that the gospel writer Luke starts off in the first couple of verses of his gospel says, I really researched these things. Mm-hmm. And certainly he had a historical context in mind. He was connecting Jesus' birth to the story of Israel. Yeah. And even in chapter 2, when he writes at the beginning of chapter 2, the beginning of the Christmas story, he said, in those days a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. He's connecting it to what's going on in the world, and that's what we're trying to do.
Right, and how did we get to this emperor named Caesar, right? Or Augustus, Caesar Augustus. And it's fascinating because these people, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, oh goodness, what a history. And in so many ways, they were always, they're kind of getting their rear ends kicked for most of it.
So there are 2 major events around which almost all of the Old Testament is written. The 2 major events are the Exodus and the exile. The Exodus meaning that story of how the people are formed with Moses as they come out of Egypt, out of slavery, wander through that wilderness and begin to take on this land, alternately called Canaan, alternately called Palestine, eventually obviously called Israel. And so the Exodus is the formative event, and then the next huge event, the exile.
Mm-hmm. And the exile, so you probably remember the stories of King David and of Solomon. That's the high point. And Solomon does something very important. He builds the temple. And it's one of the wonders of the world, right? So this is kind of the pinnacle of Israel's political influence in the region. They were somebodies for a while. And the temple proved it. And the temple also represented God is with us. And God
They literally believed that God was encased in that's where his presence was felt, in the temple.
In the temple. And then but one of the problems after Solomon as a series of mostly bad kings, occasionally they get a good king, was that this belief began to come up like, well, as long as the temple's here, God's not going to let anything happen to us.
Right.
And it doesn't really matter how we behave, follow God's laws or not, or worship whatever. Well, the temple's there, we're good. The temple became a safety belt for them. And they felt like, well, God's never going to let anything happen to that. And that's not the case. Israel begins to fall apart. They splinter right after Solomon into northern kingdom, southern kingdom.
The 10 northern tribes called Israel, the 2 southern tribes called Judah, which had Benjamin kind of lumped in with Judah. And then by 722, there's an attack on the 10 northern tribes by the Assyrians, which would be, again, in present-day Iran, Iraq. The Assyrians come.
Powerful world empire.
Powerful world empire. They come and they literally drag off many of the leading citizens, the educated.
And not only that, if you've ever heard of the lost tribes of Israel, really these 10 tribes are never heard from again.
Right.
They almost
wiped off the map.
They assimilate into Assyrian culture. There are some left, a few people left, that become the Samaritans who intermingle religion and race with the people that the Assyrians bring in. That's why the Samaritans and the nation of Judah hated each other so much.
Because we're the pure bloods and the mud bloods,
and you're the
so forth.
Yeah. It was kind of a Harry Potter thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, our kids of a certain age that we lived through that.
Yeah.
But then, so you get this. So you get that they're gone. Right, but the Southern Kingdom, they are steadfast in their belief. We've got the temple, therefore we're right. Nothing's going to happen to this, and that's where you start. If you go back and read through Jeremiah, some of the prophets, it's like, no, that's not what God wants. So in 586, there's another empire, the Babylonians, who have succeeded the Assyrians. Well, they come in and they
starve out Jerusalem. Jerusalem is built up on a hill, and it's really difficult in many respects to attack because it's on this hill. It's easily defended. It has its own water source that comes up into the center of it. And for about 3 years, Jerusalem is able to fend off this siege. But as you read the book of Lamentations and other books, you get this story of how awful things are.
We think COVID lockdown was bad.
Yeah.
At least we had food.
So this blockade finally destroys Jerusalem. Jerusalem falls. The temple is breached, and
not only breached, it's
destroyed.
It's stripped of all of its value. It had a lot of gold and all kinds of valuable items. Those are all destroyed. One of the most holy relics they had, right? The Ark of the Covenant. What happens to that? I mean, Indiana Jones knows, but what happens to the Ark of the Covenant?
So we don't know. It's taken off.
And the Ark of the Covenant, by the way, resided in the temple in the Holy of Holies, and it was supposedly carried the original 10 Commandments stones that Moses
that was at the heart of Israel's faith, that
right.
This is a God who spoke and gave us this. Yeah. So then as we get down through this history, we recognize that this is a theological emergency. The people called Israel, they have been attacked, they've been wiped out, they are questioning where is God in all of this and how can we go forward?
And not only that, they are transported to a foreign land. And if you want to get an understanding of what it was like there, read Psalm 137. Mm-hmm. It talks about by Babylon. In Babylon, we sat by, we wailed, we cried,
How can we sing our songs in this strange foreign land?
And that was a big question for them, because if the temple's gone and we're not in the land, who are we? And so most people, I think most nations, would have disappeared at that point.
And this is where the synagogue comes into existence. The synagogue becomes not another temple, but a place where people could gather to talk about the law, to talk about their scriptures, to try to figure out if the worship life of Israel was no longer the temple, what was it then? And then it becomes much more centered on the Torah.
And so what happens is, rather than center your religious life in a building, they begin to center their religious life in their sacred stories. And this is where the Torah is, I guess the word is codified. Mm-hmm. It's where these stories existed. They were in scraps and bits and pieces in the oral tradition, but they begin to bring all these sources together and say, this is our story. This is who we are. This is what we believe. This is where we come from, even in the midst of a foreign land.
And you do have various strands, various groups that you see influence the full development of the Torah and the other books of the what we refer to as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. And so the next important thing that happens after the exile is about 50 years later, there's a king by the name of Cyrus. Cyrus is called fascinatingly enough, in the scriptures, he is called God's anointed one. The same word from which we get the Messiah. Cyrus is called an instrument of God. And Cyrus, this foreign king, decides to let the people of Israel, at least a small part, led by first Ezra, Nehemiah, a group starts to begin to formulate a plan to go back to Jerusalem to first rebuild the walls, finally rebuild the city. And that happens starting at about 528, 530 BC.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot. So we're going to, we still have about 500 years to go before we get to the birth of Jesus. So we'll talk more about that tomorrow. So thank you for being with us, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. See you tomorrow.